Hello, everyone. While we're waiting for audience to stream in, as usual, just a couple of quick announcements, and then we'll hand it over to the speakers and discussants today. Announcement number one remains the same as last week. Many of you already know that the data that was collected between September to December of last year is already available to researchers. For those of you that don't know, the data is now available if you're a subscriber to CPDX. Please go and start using the data as much as you like. Um, in Wave 21, there's a brand new module on migration. If you're interested in research on migration, this is again a great opportunity and something that you can use. We've also been conducting a lecture series on survey design. We've completed two of these webinars now. The first one was on survey design and sample. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week was a lecture on sample survival, attrition, response rates. Both of those webinars are already online. You can take a look at them. The third of these webinars is this week, this Friday, on the system of weights that we use in Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. Please do come. It's a really great turnout, and it's been a great show so far. So please come this Friday as well if you can make it. Next month, we already have two research seminars lined up. One is by Manavi Gupta and Avinash Kishore at IFPRI. The other is by Anup Malani at the University of Chicago and Arpit Gupta at NYU Stern. We'll have more details sent to all of you over email very soon. Finally, and this is my last announcement, for those of you who have started using our data and are putting together research but don't want to share it with the world yet, I'm just letting you know we've now been almost booked out into April for the CPHS research seminar, even though we are now doing 2 seminars a month instead of the original 1 seminar a month. So even if you are doing something that's very much work in progress, you should probably let us know if you'd like a slot to present, because the earliest slot that you'll get now is in May. This is great news that so much research is being done with CPHS. And if you have papers or research that's underway, please do let us know. Reach out to me. My email address is kkrishnan@cmi.com, and we'll be happy to get you a slot. Now, I am about to hand it over to our speakers, but first a quick introduction. Today's talk is on the dynamics of inequality and poverty in India. Very fascinating topic, and I'm really, really glad to see this paper being written because it fundamentally uses parts of the data that haven't yet been used a lot by other researchers. And it's, I think, very exciting for all of us to see results from the income data and from other parts of the household survey. The authors today are Nishant Kumar from Dwara Research and Anand Sahasranaman, who is at both Kriya University as well as Imperial College London. The paper will be discussed by Bharti Nandwani, who's a faculty member at IGIDR. Nishant, Anand, Bharti, welcome all of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for presenting and for discussing your work. Audience, a quick note to all of you in case anyone here is new. The Q&A box is open to all of you. Please type in your questions. Usually, if the authors can, one author will try and type in answers while the other author is presenting. But if not, there's time at the end for authors to answer their questions. As usual, authors, you get 1 hour to present. That's up until 7 p.m. Bharti will then get up to 30 minutes to discuss the paper. Any time that's left over goes to Anand and Nishant to respond, after which we open up the floor to Q&A. So that's it from me. Thank you again, Anand and Nishant, for writing this paper and presenting. Anand, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kaushik and Mahesh, for having us over and for giving us this opportunity to present some of the initial work that we have done in trying to explore inequality and poverty in India using the CMI data. So let me just quickly share the screen. I hope this is visible to everyone. So what we're going to be talking about today is, a discussion on some work that we've been doing over the past 2 or 3 years on the dynamics of the income distribution in India, with a particular focus on the dynamics at the very bottom of the distribution. The questions that we're interested in exploring relate to inequality and to the dynamics of poverty as well. So my name is Anand Sahasranaman. I'm from Kriya University, and along with Nishant, over the next hour or so, we'll talk you through the major results of our research so far, as well as introduce you to some of the questions that we hope to address going forward as well. So before we get into the work itself, I thought it might be useful to lay out some context here. The context sort of helps us think a little bit about why we think these questions are important and how we even came upon some of these questions. If you think about inequality and poverty in India, I mean, these are questions on inequality and poverty have been discussed in great depth and breadth over the last 70 years in India. These, in some ways, have been the animating questions around economic policy. And if we think about the history of post-independence India, you could broadly sort of categorize the past 70 odd years into 3 phases. I'm sort of going to give you a set of stylized facts here so that we make sense of this, this long stretch of time in a short framework. The first sort of, phase is, I would say, between independence and 1980, when it was the articulated ambition of the new independent Indian government to address this question of inequality, to curb the elite economic power in India. And the way this was done was through capturing the the commanding heights of the economy, as it was called, and by imposing high tax rates, especially at very high incomes. So the high noon of this was around 1970, when the marginal tax rates on the highest incomes were close to 98%, right? And the impact of this was clearly visible in the income distribution. So if you look at this period before 1980, on the left panel in our screen, we see that the income share of the top 10% of income earners declined from about 40% to less than 30% over this 30-year period. The income share of the top 1% of income earners declined from about 12% to about 6%. So clearly, these were very significant declines at the top of the income distribution, and correspondingly, we see that the income share of the bottom 50%, which is the middle line in the curve, the dark brown line, and there you see it goes up from about 20% to 24% in the same time frame. So clearly, these policies of government ownership as well as high taxation did result in the transfer of resources from the upper half of the distribution to the lower half of the distribution. However, we have to look at this outcome in the context of the other important economic imperative in India, which was poverty reduction. India was a very, very poor country in 1947. If you look at the right-hand panel, that is sort of the evolution of the headcount ratio of poverty in India from 1952 to 2006. And we find that between 1950 and 1980, poverty overall didn't show much of a significant drop at all. It remained consistent at over 50% during this time. I mean, there were ups and downs around that 50%, but overall it didn't decline below that level. So despite the activity we see in the distribution, where income is being transferred from the top to the bottom, the overall measures of poverty, however, showed almost no decline. There's a couple of reasons for this, much written about. One is the rate of growth in India for this period was in the region of 3 to 3.5% per annum, and this was just not sufficient enough to pull people out and redistribute at the same time. And the second important aspect was between 1950 and 80, the population of India doubled. So given both of these factors, we see that poverty decline did not occur at all, despite the dramatic changes in the income distribution in India. Between 1980 and 2000, which is the second phase, we see that the trends have started reversing. So we see that the income shares of the top 10%, which is the green curve, and the top 1%, which is the light brown curve, have started increasing up again. They're trending up now. So between 1980 and 2000, the share of the top 10% went up from less than 30% to about 40%. And the share of the top 1% went up from about 6% to about 12%. So clearly there was a significant increase in these 20 years in the shares of the top incomes. And correspondingly, if you look at the middle line, we see that the share of the bottom half of the income distribution declined from about 24% back to 20%, which it was around the time of independence. So inequality, as we can see, is clearly increasing in this period. But now when we look at the right panel, the poverty panel, between 1980 and 2000, we actually see significant reductions in poverty. We see a drop from that 50% kind of level to about 35% by the end of 2000. So, and this, of course, coincides with India's sort of turn away from socialism in many ways. It is most starkly captured in the balance of payment crisis in 1991. But India moved away from being extremely protectionist, state-run economy to allowing more private participation, reduced tax rates. So from a high of 98% in about 1970, the marginal tax rate on top income was about 30% by 2000. And while all this was happening, we saw inequality increasing and poverty declining. And the narrative that has always been used in India, and rightly so, within the period that we're considering in 1980 to 2000, was that it is inevitable almost that inequality would increase if we wanted to have economic growth and poverty reduction. What's most interesting is, however, the phase post-2000. We see that inequality continues to go up quite dramatically now. The income share of the top 10%, which was less than 30% in 1980, is now over 50% in 2015, which is where this time series ends. Now, this time series is not using the CPHS data, obviously. This was data that was put out by the World Inequality Database. Piketty and Shankel put this out for India, where they sort of tried to model the Indian income distribution from 1922 to 2014. Now, this the panel on your left is really a sort of description of that data. But what it's really telling us is that top incomes really shoot up in the period after 2020. The income of the top 1% goes up to about over 20%, and the income of the bottom 50% has declined to about 14% now. So incomes of the bottom 50% are at historic lows. Incomes of the top 1%, the top 10% are at historic highs as of 2015 based on this data. But again, when you look at the right, we see that continual decline in poverty. So the question that this sort of provoked in us was to say, well, how much can inequality rise and how much can poverty decline like this in the way that we are seeing now? Is there something happening at the bottom of the distribution that we are not paying attention to? So this was the motivation for us to ask some of the research questions that we will try and address over the next hour. Is really around how have incomes evolved in India over time. Now, the previous slide was a snapshot using some other data till about 2014. But from 2014, we have the CPHS data, which is very granular monthly data on income that we can use to talk meaningfully about the past 6 years. What is happening to poverty over this time? And really, what this data is now allowing us is to unpack some of these questions. It's, oftentimes in a lot of these questions around inequality and poverty, we can say things about trends at an all India level, which is what I discussed in the previous slide. But often the most interesting things are happening at a somewhat more disaggregated level. Considering the heterogeneity in economic paths that Indian states have taken since independence, it's almost obvious that the most interesting things are probably happening at the level of states. How different are these paths? What can we say about the dynamics of rural versus urban India? What can we say about the dynamics of inequality across Indian states? How different are they? How much sense does it actually make to speak about some of these issues only at the level of India? And more provocatively, does it make any sense at all only to speak about India? And particularly, as I said, our interest was in the state of the bottom incomes in the distribution. What are the dynamics that are happening at the bottom of the distribution? Who is at the bottom of the distribution? What are the occupations? Where are these people present? So these are the kinds of questions that the data in some ways try to allow us to answer. And finally, what we'll conclude with is to using these outcomes that we'll present to you, we try to model the Indian income distribution over time to get a sense of both the nature and the quantum of reallocation that's occurring within the Indian income distribution. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Nishant to present some of the results that we have.
Hey, hi. Anand, just mic check. You here? Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Just continue from where Anand left off. So thank you so much again, guys, for having me over. Okay, so I hope my screen is visible, and I'm starting with the same slide Anand had ended with. So yes, so these are kind of the questions that we're asking. So over the next few kind of slides, what I'm going to try and do is paint you a picture of what did we see in the CPHS data. So as Anand mentioned, we've gone through analyses using data sets that help us track the evolution of incomes over time previously and over a longer stretch of time. But now we have consolidated more granular incomes at a monthly level, in fact, from CPHS. So I'm going to try and go through about the different things that we did to construct the income distribution for India, think about how do we measure inequality, or how do we sort of put forth a more empirical perspective of what is happening across the distribution, and particularly at the bottom end of the distribution. And then we'll see some interesting cuts, and hopefully time permits, I'll show you some interesting pictures of how this changes across rural and urban, across different states, kind of the occupational profile of the Indian income distribution, and kind of also point to hopefully for your identifying for yourselves what would be interesting questions that we would like to take forward. And I'll throw it back to Anand towards the end to explain the kind of the modeling aspect of how we're thinking about using this data as well as the insights to think about and say something more specifically about the nature of reallocation, and possibly thinking about the future of welfare policy in India. So that's a lot. So just kind of wrapping it back together, we're using the CPHS data, and thank you. And this is obviously the CPHS research seminar, so I don't have to give a lot of you already kind of the insights into the data, although I will, and I will at different points of time conveniently point to Kaushik as well, and his wonderful lecture series happening on the research, on the construction of the CPHS survey itself. But for those for those few of you who might not have an idea, the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey is what we're using to create the income distribution, or to construct the income distribution for us to analyze at a national level. We're using the data that is available between 2014 and 19. These are nationally as well as state-wise representative estimates of income. And we're using this time frame because 2014 is the kind of earliest year in which we have estimates on income, and 2019, and we wanted a kind of complete picture. So 2014 to 19 gives us about good 6 years of solid income data, monthly income data to work with. So that's about 18 waves in the CPHS nomenclature. So that's about 3 waves every year happens, and across these waves, household income estimates are collected through the survey. The way the sampling is done, again, I'm not going to go into it. The hyperlink here is to the lecture series that Kaushik and Mahesh and other people at CMI are doing on the sampling design. but I've put in a note for anybody again who's not familiar with it to take a look at it. The sample approximately has about 160,000 households per wave. We have about 18 waves of data between 2014 and 19. We have continued to kind of create income distribution and look at the kind of insights from the income distribution post 2019, which is entering the COVID phase, and and that's something we're not going to talk about in this presentation. But again, we've done it, and we're planning to add it to some of the paper, the paper that we've already written. But as Anand said, we're kind of interested in thinking about the evolution of incomes over a longer period of time. So just did not think it would be right to put those figures in this presentation. But happy to discuss it afterwards. In terms of construction, the only thing I want to point out here is that, conventionally when we're looking across income distributions, we look for estimates on income per capita. So we're using household incomes provided by the CPHS data and kind of normalizing it to create income per capita estimates throughout every month. So we have monthly per capita income estimates, but constructed using a panel of household data. We further normalize it using an equivalence class measure, specifically something that just a square root equivalence class measure. Again, something that's used in literature a little bit when analyzing kind of per capita estimates of economic characteristics, especially in households in the context of poverty, consumption, and inequality. And again, I'm not going to go into the math of this, but it's been, again, used predominantly in literature. To give you just a snapshot of what it essentially means is that when we're considering per capita estimates, we typically take, the total income of the household and kind of divide it by the number of members in the household. Where kind of instead of taking that, we're taking the square root of the number of members in the household. This essentially helps us normalize for different characteristics that kind of limit or in some show the income estimates to be quite extreme when we look at households with larger sizes. And it's just to keep a more conservative lens when looking at incomes of larger households. This does not drastically change any of our estimates, and most of our results continue to hold true even if this is not the case, but we just built that this construction would make sense economically and more rigorously. I have great couple of papers to refer to understand that perfectly. Okay, so this is the kind of data. So all we're using from the CPHS is basically monthly incomes and and the allied characteristics or covariates that come. So to give you a first good picture of what we did with the data, you can see the graph on your left, which is basically the time series. So we had created the income distribution for each year and basically have split the income distribution into deciles. And we've just shown you the fraction of incomes owned or earned by each decile. So the top line, as you see, the dark, bright red, if you will, is the richest decile of the income distribution in India, and kind of the trends that they see. So these are, as you can see, when we're talking about shares of income, while the figure that Anand had showed, kind of, you could see graphs that vary quite a bit over the spread of years. That's because that was an evolution of time periods for more than like 50, 60 years. Here we're looking at smaller time frames. Yes, there will be kind of more marginal differences, but these marginal differences mean a lot, both in terms of shares as well as in terms of real values when we talk about income. So we'll get to that when we get to more interesting estimates, but this figure just shows you how each decile of the income has changed. A lot of the middle portion of the distribution remains fairly constant. But the first interesting insight that you would kind of get is just how far away the top decile is from the rest in terms of contributing to the shares of income of the entire economy. Okay, so that's the kind, and you see that's hovering around 35%. And this is a caveat to say, if you go back to the first figure that Anand had showed you from the data from the tax databases that Piketty and Chance had used. That showed the same period around 2014-15, the fraction of income owned by the top 10 percentile was about 50% or above 50%. And from the CPHS data, we have 30%, 35%, and it's completely understandable because um, uh, there is it is fairly understood that extremely high incomes would be harder to capture, and so we're kind of very nicely left with a conservative picture of the income distribution in India, which is good for us because we can make conservative estimates, and hence our kind of insights become strong. Okay, so that's the broad picture, and that's how you would see when you see the picture on the left. Couple of interesting things is that over this period of time, there's been a marginally progressive trend. You see the income share of the top 2 deciles in the top 20% of the income drop from 51 to 49. That's just 2 percentages if you think about it. But then when you think about in population sample sizes or in terms of share of income, that's quite a lot. And equally worrying trend, while it's not completely visible in this graph, would be the decline in the share of incomes in the bottom decile. So really, the maroon line at the bottom would show you that there's a marginal decline in income. So that's about from 1.5 to about 1.2%. Again, marginal in terms of share, but huge when you think about quantum. So these are kind of the marginal progressive trends, but we have that caveat to say the bottom deciles are still not doing well. In fact, their income shares are dropping. One way to also measure inequality, typically for those of you who've studied development economics or like any economics per se, so you kind of usually study inequality using measures such as Gini. We've instead used something called the K index, called the Kolkata index. I think it's recently published brilliant work done by researchers. The lead researcher being from ISI Calcutta, and which kind of is a really interesting measure if you think about it, more intuitive way, because it gives you a sense of and a more generalization of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 principle, typically used to kind of signal inequality or conventionally talk about it, was the Pareto 80-20 principle. 20% of the population owns about 80% or earns about 80% of the income. Right? So the K index kind of gives you a very similar way. In fact, the mathematics of it are quite splendid, and recommend you to look it up and read about it when you can. But in general, it gives you a very, very intuitive way to measure inequality across the income distribution. And when we used that, we saw about across the years there isn't so much of a change per se, kind of, and which you would expect in a shorter time frame. But the K index is about 0.66, which refers to about 35% of the population earning about 65% of the income, of the total income. That's what it kind of signifies. And it's a very good way if you want to look at inequality, even at like kind of disaggregated levels. It's a great measure to look at. And that's what we did, and we kind of saw this number coming out, and it's pretty stable throughout. Okay, so to kind of dig deeper into what these were talked about, we talked about in terms of the shares of income owned by each decile. So if you kind of go in and look at the aggregate, the real income, the real income growth, to give you a sense of what happened to the actual real incomes and not just the shares or the allocations of incomes along the distribution. We kind of looked at we plotted something called the growth incidence curve, which is basically the x-axis just gives you the distribution. Each point on the x-axis is just the percentile of the income distribution. We've plotted ventiles, which means every 5 tiles of the income distribution, to just show you one interesting fact. But before that, the y-axis is just the CAGR, or the compounded annual growth rate of average annualized incomes. So the monthly incomes are converted into annual incomes. And we have that between 2014 and 19. Okay. So the CAGR of these ventiles of population pretty much are increasing, right? So you see a large portion of the income distribution growing on average about 7%, 6.5, 7%, and across the income distribution. And you even see some of what you think are the middle class to be growing at the highest levels in terms of income, which is a very kind of progressive trend. But what the most obvious and particular outlier here, and I would not even say an outlier here because of what we will see earlier next, is that the bottom ventile or the bottom two ventiles are showing very low values of growth. In fact, the bottom ventile is significantly negative. So this means there's a real loss in income for the bottom ventile of the distribution. So, and these are all adjusted for CPI, inflation indexed values. So that's why it's real income loss. So you see real income loss for the bottom ventile of the distribution. So conventionally, when we think about this and conventional discourse around inequality, is that there is a general acceptance that yes, share of incomes through the income distribution, share of incomes off the bottom of the income distributions are going down, but then there is real income growth. That's how we kind of rationalize a lot of the economic growth that we're having, which in turn increasing the inequality. But what we've seen over the last two slides is just a simple two pictures which show you both the allocation or the shares of income in the bottom part of the income distribution are reducing, and there is a real decline in value, real income earned by the bottom of the income distribution. So so clearly what Anand was saying is that our particular idea to study the bottom of the income distribution comes from these kind of very outlier effects that you see in the data. And this is not something that's just a facet of this data. It's just something that we're seeing across evolution, the evolutionary seeds that we saw using the Piketty data as well. Okay, so these two pictures show you something about the national representation. So if you want to further decompose this to see what's happening, is that I'll show you the next picture, which is basically decomposing the growth incidence curves across rural and urban segments, right? So the rural and urban segments are decomposed in blue and green lines on the picture on your left. Again, the x-axis is the same. It's just percentage of income. We're plotting only deciles here. So just don't get confused. It's just easier to see the dots, but the lines are the same across all the figures that we're showing. It's just the distribution of income across, just spread across 0 to 100 normalized scales. And we're plotting the CAGR again, right? So clearly you see, let's start with the urbans. It's kind of, because it's a nice picture to see, it's progressive, is that you see higher income growth rates at the bottom of the distribution. That's slowly reducing over the course of this. So low income households are gaining higher, are seeing a high increase in their real income, and richer households are seeing still seeing a increase in their income, but not as much as the lower income households, right? So in urban, we do see this. This is an interesting phenomenon. A lot of researchers might kind of see this and maybe take this as a surprising insight, but this is kind of what the data shows us. And on the flip side, if you see, on the flip side, if you see the rural one, it kind of points to similar to our earlier picture when we talked about the national GIC, which was just that the bottom decile of the rural income distribution again is showing starkly negative regimes of growth. So this real income loss is happening at the bottom of the rural income distribution in India. So you could somewhat say that when we split and look at the kind of income distribution in India, so we have dropping shares at the bottom. We're seeing dropping value in terms of real income and growth rates, and we're seeing dropping incomes, real incomes in the rural lower income households. So rural low income doing very bad. Again, it's not a big surprise to, if you've been studying India for a while. It's just something that you would expect, but not. What did startle us was the extent to which these numbers show that there is a decline in growth rates. So let's see another cut. So this is so this still doesn't tell us what necessarily is contributing to the negative growth slump. It just gives us a nice picture to see that. Just quickly to just run you through again a very interesting graph. Again points to the same point I was trying to make, which was just that when you just look at a ratio of rural income to urban income at each percentile of their respective distributions, you see the shares to be quite disparately low for the first 10 or so for the first decile. So see the first 10 or so points on dots on your left, that shows you the ratio between rural income to urban income at the same income percentile. So it just drastically pinpoints back to the earlier kind of insight that we're making, is just that if you're at the bottom of the rural income distribution, you're quite far away from seeing any income growth, but you're also quite far away from the respective income growths that your urban counterparts are seeing. So I'm going to stop there. Let's quickly jump into occupation groups, right? So one other thing that we're often interested about is knowing more about the income distribution in terms of occupation groups. This is a fairly simple graph, and most of you who've played with the CPHS data might have created something like this or something similar, which is just looking at the occupational decomposition of the income distribution. Right? So you see that from the left to right, different colors of the charts allocate to different occupational groups. I'm using the same classes offered by the CPHS data, so no real manipulation of classes here. And what is very starkly interesting is that when you start from the left, you see the blue lines and the gray lines becoming a large portion, which comprise of the large portions of the left-hand side of your distribution, which are cultivators or farm agricultural workers and wage laborers. Right? So farmers and wage laborers, predominantly or informal economy, contribute the large portions of your first two, or the first set of first parts of your income decile, bottom parts of your income decile, as opposed to you see the growing or increasing line, the yellow line, which just talks about the formal sector or the salaried employed class. So you see the right of the income distribution being comprised of more of the formally employed or the regular salaried class. So this points to some very specific hypothesis, something that we had, something we've been exploring separately as well, which is maybe the hypothesis here comes back to thinking about welfare programs and specifically, social safety nets, which are available for these formal sector employees, which are not so available for these informal sector employees, aka the ones that we're seeing have negative growth rates as well as declining shares of income. So essentially, that could be something to understand better when we're thinking about solutions or thinking about like even further diagnosing the problem of these negative growth rate problem and the inequality problem. But this picture kind of gives you an insight that it's a kind of simple insight which just shows you who comprises of this bottom two ventiles, so the bottom decile of the income distribution. Okay, quickly moving on. Another interesting thing, again, because I showed you kind of shares, I'm more inclined to show you the real values as well, just for kind of consistency. So if you look at this picture, it's just plotting growth rates. It's not a GIC curve, but it's just plotting the growth rates, compounded annual growth rates that we have for different occupational groups. So there's again a lot going on in this graph, and just don't get too confused. Let's just point to just look at everything before the black line and the dark orange line, which actually goes negative. That's the curve that represents the growth rates of wages or income for the farming sector or households that are involved in the group, farmer occupational group. And you see that group again has been facing negative growth rates from about, in this graph it shows about 2018, mid 2018 or end 2018, but there's been a significant even pre-COVID, there's been a significant period where this group of occupation groups have faced a negative real growth rate, which means there's actually, loss in real income for this group. As opposed to, you would see the dark green line, which is the salaried class, have pretty much not seen that, not up until COVID actually struck, or just after that. So after COVID, again, it's pretty much everybody goes down the line, and there's just real income loss of incomes across all these occupation groups. Something that again would have come up, more interesting insights would have come up in the last research seminar series, which talked about occupations in more detail, especially in the context of COVID. But just for us to look at the evolution, there are two things to point here. One is that, again, we see the same low income cultivator groups have experiencing negative periods of growth, real income growth. As well as you see a very interesting longer term, I would say long term, medium to short term, in fact, trend of declining incomes across all occupation groups, right? And that's something we haven't figured out what is happening or why it's happening. That's in general just an interesting insight that we've not been able to explain using the distribution data. That kind of points to more interestingness thrown at our study of how the distribution has been changing over time. Okay, so we've seen kind of the overall national income distribution. We decomposed it using both the share as well as the growth incidence curves. We saw the same for rural and urban splits. We saw the same for occupational groups. The one thing that we want to expand our work is actually, be realistic and sort of not think about modeling per se inequality or kind of income distributions for the country, because as the cliche goes, is that every state in our country is almost a country in itself because of various disparate economic, demographic characteristics that kind of define them, as well as the different policy regimes or welfare regimes, to be particular, that each of them have kind of seen over time. But again, just to show you some very preliminary insights, we've not published this as part of our work earlier. Something that we're kind of doing to kind of get a better sense of how we can extract some of these interesting insights, especially at the bottom of the distribution. But just to give you a kind of very, very broad picture, the map on your left basically shows, hopefully correctly, a map on your left shows the kind of the growth rates or the GICs for the bottom decile of income distribution in each state. Right? So essentially, the colors in the states colored in red are basically states that have seen real income loss in the bottom decile. That's what we're using as a measure to see, has there been positive reallocation or negative reallocation in the state, in the distribution. And those which are colored in green are basically states that are experiencing positive growth in terms of real income. We're not showing you anything in terms of like the quantitative differences or like in any kind of continuous scale, just to show you positive and negative, because we feel that's a strong enough phase transition in itself to keep it as two kind of differentiated groups. But very interesting to say. I'm not going to pick out reasons why, and there might be experts, better in this kind of audience who might be able to explain why, or maybe give us some qualitative insight. But just to give you some highlights, is just to see states like UP and Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh showing kind of strong negative growth, even Gujarat to some extent. Some negative growth of incomes at the bottom of the income distribution, right, over this period of time, 2014 and 19. And then you have states in Rajasthan, Punjab, Uttarakhand who are showing kind of strong positive growths in incomes at the bottom of the income distribution, right? So again, don't know why, but just this is purely to say that this is not an overall India trend as we're seeing it. This could be fueled by, specific actions, specific policies happening in different parts, like specific parts of the country. Right? So if I were to do this, and there is nothing that kind of tells us that the states that we're considering, TN and UP specifically, are outliers in any form, and they just representative. They're used here as a representative example of showing the divergent trajectories that any state could have when thinking about its growth incidence curve, right, or the growth that they have faced across the income distribution over the last 5 years. Right? See, the picture on your left shows you those different trajectories. So UP colored in orange almost. It's very interesting. Has about 3 deciles of its income population have seen negative growth rates. Have you seen real losses in income over the last 6 years? And as you go across the income distribution from low to high, there has been significant positive, there's a positive slope when you're talking about the growth rates of income across the income distribution. So the richer are getting richer faster. On the green side, you have Tamil Nadu, which again has, as I would say, the completely different states in all evolution, in terms of evolution of welfare policy, in terms of Tamil Nadu having stronger labor laws. All of that considered, we're not trying to compare these states. It's just to show that there are completely 2 different regimes that you can see within the same country. And in Tamil Nadu, you see more kind of what you would typically call progressive. And I say progressive in air quotes only because we don't know qualitatively if it has made a difference. But you see the bottom of the income distribution seeing the kind of highest growth rates in income. And as you go down, it keeps reducing until at a point it turns negative, which you think is a fairly progressive trend. So this kind of encapsulates our kind of finding that across the country, when we're looking at both the GICs as well as looking for evidence of of strong inequality, we're seeing very, very different pictures across each states. Again, something that's not going to baffle your mind in terms of an insight, but just to give you a very stark picture of how different they can be. And I think in the kind of work that we're doing going forward is trying to think about what identifies each state so differently, only with respect to its income distribution, only with respect to features of the income distribution that we're talking about. So not in terms of more kind of qualitative work. So again, so where this is all going is not to just stop at giving you these kind of descriptions. While I promised on Twitter that I would provide some interesting pictures, the idea was to take this to an extent where we're telling you what we could do in order to arrive at a better understanding of how reallocation or redistribution is happening across the income distribution. So for that, I think I'm going to pass it back to Anand, who will kind of go through all the different the kind of modeling technique that we used and the kind of model that we used to kind of use the income distribution and think about further as to how we can develop kind of more granular insights on it. So Anand, back to you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
All right. So let me just go back to sharing this. All right. So Nishant, left us here talking, giving us somewhat of a brief introduction into some of the work we've started on, how different states and their income distributions have evolved over time. This is work that we hope will be much deeper, and at some point maybe get back to Kaushik. And I know your slots are filling up fast, so maybe it might not be soon, but at some point maybe come back and present in more detail what we are finding across the very different states in our country. So as Nishant said, now one of the things that we want to do, given all these empirical findings that we have around the nature of dynamics occurring at the bottom of the Indian income distribution in terms of income share, in terms of the kinds of income growth that we are seeing, which on average seems to be negative at the very bottom of the distribution. The question that we wanted to ask next was to say, is there a way in which we can model this and make sense of the nature of reallocation that's occurring within the income distribution? What kind, or what is the extent of this reallocation within the Indian income distribution? What is the nature of this reallocation within this income distribution? So in order to try and answer some of these questions, what we did was to work on a model where we used to, or work on a model to try and recreate the Indian income distribution and propagate it over time and see if it told us anything interesting about the dynamics of inequality in India. So the model that we used is a relatively new model that we've been working with a group from the London Mathematical Institute. These guys have been working on a model called geometric Brownian motion with reallocation, or RGBM, to try and create income distributions around the world. Now, the geometric Brownian motion, for anybody who's studied physics or mathematics, it's a fairly simple process. It's a multiplicative process that yields a sort of a widening log normal distribution over time. Now, why is that interesting to us? The reason that becomes interesting to us is that multiple studies of income and wealth distributions across countries in the world have shown us that the log normal is actually a very good descriptor of real income distributions, at least for a major part of the income distribution. The moment we get to the tails of these distributions, then those are probably best described by power laws. But given our interest is in the other end, the bottom of the distribution, geometric Brownian motion offers us a nice way to think about modeling such a distribution. However, there's an important aspect that this does not cover. If you think about geometric Brownian motion, if I were to model it, all it would yield is over time my distribution would keep widening, which means that there would be a condensation of wealth, or an increasing condensation of wealth with a smaller and smaller proportion of the population, right? So you will see this concentration of wealth happening, which we know happens in reality. But what we also know that happens in reality is that almost all modern societies have mechanisms to reallocate resources, to redistribute resources. In fact, we could argue that the primary role of government in any country is to be the arbiter of reallocation, whether this is through taxation and then through distribution. So we have these systems across all these countries. So clearly, just a dumb model of a geometric Brownian motion is clearly not going to be at all realistic about the kinds of dynamics we expect in the income distribution. So the most interesting thing that Berman, Peters, and Adamu, who developed this initial model, did was to say, how do we incorporate this reallocation in this model? And we sort of used a very simple mechanism to do this. So if you look at the equation in front of us, it describes the change in the income of an individual over a small time period. And this change in income consists of two components. One is a growth term, and one is a reallocation term. Now, the growth term, which is sort of a part of the equation that describes income growth, consists of two parts. One is systematic or systemic growth, which is to say that this is the kind of growth that is, that affects everyone in the economy, whether it's a general economic environment, whether it's economic policies that are in operation, general institutional environment. All of these affect institutions and individuals in pretty much the same way, and either contribute to increasing growth or decreasing growth in a way that's common to all of us. But there's also this notion of idiosyncratic growth, that growth that is relevant only to individuals. This might be aspects of hard work, luck, all of these things that are hard to average across a population. So that is what we term as idiosyncratic growth. So the overall growth of an individual's income sort of comprises of both these components, a systemic component and an idiosyncratic component. And we use the parameters mu and sigma in this model to try and get at those. We use historical data on incomes and commodity prices in India to estimate mu and sigma for the Indian income distribution. And then the second term in this model is what's called the reallocation term. And now the reallocation term, if you look within the brackets, within the parentheses, you see that it's simply the difference between the individual's income and the average income of the nation, right? And what it's saying is that if the individual's income is greater than the average income, then the individual contributes to the distribution. Whereas if the individual's income is lesser than the average income, then the individual should get back from the distribution. So in one case where XI is greater than the average income, then the individual is a net contributor. In the other case where the individual's income is lesser than the average income, the individual is a net receiver, and which is sort of the basis of a progressive sort of reallocation system. And the most important parameter, or the parameter that this model estimates, is the parameter tau. This tau is called the reallocation parameter, and the sign of this parameter and the magnitude of this parameter tells us about the nature and the extent of reallocation that's happening in the economy, right? So for instance, if tau were to be 0, then this equation is simply the geometric Brownian motion, which leads to a widening log normal distribution over time. This is the bottom left-hand panel, right? So this sort of distribution will widen over time. The mean will diverge from the median, as you can see. And that, as we saw, might not be particularly interesting given that it doesn't capture the nature of reallocation. However, if tau is positive, this reallocation parameter is positive, then you see that middle figure at the bottom. And there you see now that the distribution is held tightly around the mean. And importantly, the mean and the median are sort of evolving together. You don't see the divergence that you see in the first figure. And what this means is that you're not seeing the emergence of those extreme kinds of income that you see in the case when tau is 0. So this is basically reflecting the fact that there is a transfer of resources from the upper part of the distribution to the lower part, and therefore the overall distribution is held somewhat tightly around the mean as it evolves. The mean itself is growing over time. So income on an average is growing, and the average incomes across the distribution are also growing. And the third regime is somewhat of a strange regime where tau is lesser than 0. Here we see that, the distribution basically diverges into two parts, where there are some people with very high incomes and a large proportion of the population with low or even negative incomes. And this is sort of the strange situation where if your income is lower than the average income, then you contribute. And if your income is higher than the average income, then you receive. So which is sort of a perversion of, any progressive reallocation system. But, that's the regime that we will be in if tau is negative. So what we're essentially doing, using the data that we have, using the data that we were able to construct from the income distribution that CPHS gave us, was to basically fit the value of tau, was to get back a value of tau given what we know about the income distribution. So the outcome of this, using this equation, is to get the time series of tau over the period that we're looking at. So this is just an illustration of how tau evolved using the previous time series that we used, which was the Piketty and Chunkel time series between 1951 and 2015. As you can see, the value of tau, and you can look at the black line that shows you the value of tau over time. This, as I told you, is the reallocation parameter, and it's largely remained above 0, as you would expect in any modern economy where redistribution exists, right? And as you can see, that's largely remained above 0, though there are some changes over time, there are fluctuations, but it has remained over 0, indicative of the fact that redistribution is occurring, and it's occurring from the higher end of the distribution to the lower end of the distribution. However, we reach a point of concern past the 2000s where we see that tau remains consistently negative up until 2015. So what this is telling us is what we saw in the previous slide, as this really bizarre regime where we are seeing redistribution from the bottom to the top, right? So in this case, we would expect that incomes at the bottom are actually declining while those at the top are increasing. So this is not just talking about income shares, but actual real income, right? And this is just sort of, from the model, we reconstruct the income shares of deciles. And as you can see, the top two deciles actually see growth. All the other deciles see declines post 2000. The bottom two deciles are especially worse off, right? This is just a further description of what's happening at the bottom decile and the bottom percentile of incomes from 1950 to 2015. Historic lows in terms of income shares. The income share of the bottom decile in 2014, based on Piketty's data, was less than 1%, and the income share of the bottom percentile was less than 0.01%. So these are historic lows of income shares at the bottom. But as we just saw, the real worry is that not only are we talking about low income shares, but actual negative income growth. And this we observe in the data after 2000 in the Piketty and Shankal case as well. And we've observed it again in the data that we have from CPHS between 2014 and 19, that there is a real decline of income in this part of the distribution. So when we apply the RGBM to the CPHS data between 2014 and 19, the left side, the left panel gives you a sense of how, you know, the modeled income distribution matches up with the empirical distribution, and we find a reasonably good fit for the various deciles that we model, right? While of course it's not exact, and the top incomes are obviously, you know, somewhat harder to model because of the, you know, power law at operation on the top. But we can see that there's very close correspondence in the bottom. The dotted lines are the modeled lines, and the solid lines are the income distributions derived from the CPHS data. So given that, you know, there seems to be a close correspondence between the model and the data, you know, perhaps the model is indeed telling us something about the real dynamics, about the nature of reallocation occurring within the income distribution. And so, therefore, when we plot the evolution of tau over these 5 years or 6 years from 2014 to 19, we find that there is a real concern again with the rural distribution. We saw that they had negative income growth. That is sort of again being reflected here in the negative taus that we see in 2017 and 18. It seems to have gone up again in 2019, but this is something that we need to watch out for over time. That a sustained, you know, negative tau, something that we saw with the previous data set, has been occurring since 2000, might still be persisting. It might be the case that a significant part of the bottom of India's income distribution has actually been seeing negative income growth over the past 20 years. And this is a real source of worry for us. You know, how does this end? Where does this go? These are questions that we need to ask ourselves now. And this is the kind of work that we are hoping to continue as we sort of break down the distribution into states, into rural and urban, into cities, to see, you know, what is the nature of evolution of tau over time, and what this is telling us about the economic prospects of those at the very bottom of the distribution. So to sum up, you know, all that we've spoken about, there is a real worry that we are seeing negative incomes in the bottom of the Indian distribution post 2000. We found this with the Piketty and Shankal data. We are finding this now with the CPHS data. This is pointing to, you know, long periods of negative redistribution or negative tau in the model, which is a sign of worry, because, you know, what happens to that social contract of redistribution in India? You know, the bottom 10% of the population, we're talking about over 100 million people. So these are not small trivial numbers. You know, these are, you know, large numbers, and you worry about what the social and economic consequences of this are. Now, one of the things that we want to do as we continue this work, as we think about states, etc., is to think, you know, is to progress this work into thinking more along, you know, what needs to be done, what are the causes of this, and what might be the consequences of this. Just some facts that our findings match up with is the increasing informalization of the formal sector workforce. We are seeing this not only happen in India, but around the world, with the sort of increasing concentration of wealth and capital with a few companies, and the nature of employment contracts that they have, which are increasingly informal in nature. We know, we have been hearing about agrarian distress over the last 25 years. You know, the debt cycles that farmers are caught in, the worries around farmer suicide. You know, these are questions that we worry about every year in the news cycle. And, you know, some of our findings clearly match up with, you know, these facts around agrarian distress. The other aspect that we are also modeling is, this notion of incidence of transitions into and out of poverty over time. So not just measures of what percent of population is poor at a given point in time, but how do households cycle through poverty over time? And there is some concern that we might be seeing greater incidence of transitioning into poverty. Now, of course, with COVID, that has definitely happened. But even prior to COVID, there were concerns that this was happening. So a lot of this work, has significant policy implications in the design of both public expenditure programs, health and education expenditure, as well as in these debates around having these, basic income or the NREGA type programs. These are very, very important policy questions. We find that these, at least our preliminary findings on this work are pointing to systemic failings in the sorts of economic models that we've used, and we have to sort of think about some of these in a deeper manner to sort of address these big challenges that we face. With that, I'll stop. I thank you so much for this opportunity on behalf of Nishant and myself to give this talk.
Anand and Nishant, thank you so much. Bharti, I'll hand it over to you now to discuss Anand and Nishant's work, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Anand and Nishant, for this presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed reading your paper, and now I'm going to start the discussion by first talking about the points that I liked about the paper, and then I'll move on to my comments and suggestions. So the first thing that I really liked about the paper was that it was done for a very recent time period, which is 2014 to 19. Now, we all know that work on income inequality in India has been mostly done using the National Sample Survey data set, the NSS. And that data set, happens over the intervals of 5 years. So we don't know what's happening in between years. We also, the last NSS round that was publicly available happened in 2012. So then, of course, we don't know what's been happening lately about inequality. So it's a nice fact documenting exercise to get a good picture of income distribution in India lately. I think it's also important because inequality now is considered as an important determinant of increased polarization all across the world. In India, it's considered as a determinant of criminal activity, armed rebellion movements, the kind of voting that we're observing. So I think it's important to know what's happening with income distribution. So that's why I think it's an important piece of work. Secondly, I feel that the authors do a good job in not just presenting inequality estimates, because inequality is just one of the aspects of income distribution. They also give us an idea of what's happening to the income share of the lower strata, of the lower people who are at the lower end of the distribution, and what's happening to people who are not at the lower end of the distribution, to actually know what's happening to their income level and to get a full picture, a holistic picture of income distribution in India. However, I feel that even though, as I mentioned, that this is a great advantage over papers which have made use of NSS data, the paper does not clearly explain the contribution that the paper makes to the literature. The paper needs to clearly spell out the advantage of doing this exercise for a very recent time period, which is 2014 to 19. I think this has not been explained in the paper well, so that needs to be done, because again, as I mentioned this earlier, right now it's important to look at what's happening to inequality, because inequality has gained the center stage again in our discussions. Secondly, I feel that 2014 to 19 is a very narrow time window to explore changes in income inequality, something which is very sticky. So I understand that the reason why you looked at 2014 to 19 is because of the data constraints, but I think acknowledging this in the paper, that this is a very short time window, and therefore you might be missing some of the changes that might actually turn out in the longer run. So it's important to mention that in the paper, because as we can see, at various places in the paper, at various figures in the paper, the income shares of, for example, second to eighth decile in figure A remains stable. So I think it's important to basically kind of mention that it's a very short time period to get changes in inequality. I think you measure inequality using Kolkata Index, the KF, but one of the most commonly used measures of inequality is Gini and Thile. So I think it's also important that you do robustness checks, that you see whether the trend that you're getting with your KF also holds with your Gini and Thile. So it will be good if you can actually present estimates of Gini and Thile as well. Also, I had this concern earlier, but now that you've mentioned in your slides that states are heterogeneous in India, and we need to see what's also happening to your income shares, to changes in inequality at the state level also. But this is something that the authors have mentioned. This is something that they're working on. So I'll quickly move over this point and I'll move on to my next point, which is why are you actually aggregating your income at the year level? Since you have monthly income data, since the waves happen thrice in a year, you can actually look at, because I think one of your figures, which was 2.4, actually we see there that the income, that the wages, there's a lot of change within year in the wages data. So you can actually explore your within year changes in income share. That might also be informative, because we see from the paper that it's the rural part of the country which is driving your negative income growth for the lowest decile. So this means that if we can actually disaggregate the yearly income distribution into agricultural seasons, we can probably get some idea as to what's happening to rural part of the country in those agricultural seasons. Do we see their income shares changing over agricultural season? And this is an advantage of this data set, that you can do this exercise, which is something that you can't do with other data sets. The other thing that I felt was that the rural income, the rural urban income share dynamics that you see, that you document, it will be nice if we get some explanation as to why, that is happening. Why do we see falling income share and negative income growth of lowest decile in rural areas, whereas something like that is not happening in the urban part of the country? Now, some of it has been mentioned by you in the presentation, but a detailed discussion on that is missing in the paper. So I think it will be nice to get some context, just some idea as to what's happening. So a part where you tell the reader about the occupation of occupation status of these people, I think that is quite informative. A detailed discussion on that will also be helpful to give the reader a nice context about what's happening. Also, why you think that this rural urban change is happening. It could be due to migration, it could be due to other things, it could be due to agrarian distress, as you mentioned in the presentation. So a detailed discussion on that could give us interesting insights, and that's something that you mentioned that you're working on. So I think that's something good. So now I move on to your RGBM methodology. Now I am not, I don't know this in detail, but I'll still point this out, that the income inequality measure that you're presenting and the income share that you're presenting, it gives us an idea that the income redistribution is not very progressive over time. And in fact, we see that the income growth has been negative for the first decile. So that tells us that the redistribution is not progressive. So what's the advantage of this RGBM that you're performing? I understand that it gives you tau, which is the redistribution parameter, and the magnitude of that can tell you about the extent of redistribution. But I didn't see anywhere in the paper a discussion on the magnitude of tau. We do get a discussion on the sign of tau, which is becoming negative in 2018, but a discussion on the parameter, size of parameter, might also be helpful. B, explaining why this method is needed when you already have presented inequality estimates and income shares. What extra information is it giving us about the redistribution is something that's needed. It's something that will add to the explanation part. Also, I felt that this tau parameter, it changed. It was positive till 2018. Of course, it was declining, but it was positive till 2018. But sorry, it was positive till 2017. Of course, it was declining. It became negative in 2018, and it then became positive in 2019. So there's a lot of changes that's happening with the sign of tau. Now, I feel that it is time sensitive. So have you tried changing values of your sigma and mu to look at how tau responds to those changed values of sigma and mu? So once you change those parameters, what is happening to your redistribution parameter is something that will give us an idea of how stable tau is to various values of mu and sigma. So that's something that maybe you can think of adding in the paper. One other thing that I had so this is a clarificatory question. Why have you only considered price of rice, wheat, gold, and jaggery for calculating your volatility parameter, that is sigma? So what's the major explanation behind considering rice, wheat? I understand, but gold and jaggery is something that if you could provide an explanation in the paper, it will be easier to understand the reason for considering these variables, these commodities for considering price volatility. The other comment that I have is that this paper by Sastranaman and Jensen to 2019 paper, this paper estimates the same exercise, the RGBM exercise, just for a longer time period. So the current paper does this exercise for a much shorter time period, 2014 to 19. So I wanted to understand, I wanted to see in the paper, how have you actually, so what's the significance of doing this for a shorter time period? An explanation of that, because this is something that's already done, and in fact for a much longer time period. The current exercise is for a much shorter time period, but for a recent period. So an explanation of why you're doing the same exercise, but the time period is important. Something explanation on that would also be, I think, helpful. I think that's about it. So to sum it up, I basically think that adding some context to your inequality estimates, to the trend that you're observing, to the fact that income growth has been negative for the lowest income group, providing some explanation is important because it has important policy implication. It does tell us that our income the income distribution is progressively over time is not becoming progressive. So I think adding some context, adding some policy implication, giving some explanation as to why this is happening will make it more interesting. Secondly, providing some explanation on the RGBM methodology would be helpful. Thirdly, trying to see what's happening within a year to get some idea, to get some explanation on your trend might also be helpful. So I think I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Kaushik.
Thanks, Bharti. Those are really excellent comments. Anand and Nishant, can I open it back up to you with some responses, please?
Sure, Nishant, shall I go first? I just had a few things.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, big thanks to Dr. Bharti Nandwani for taking the time not only to read this paper, but also some of the earlier work. And I think, a lot of these comments are actually very useful for us to, actually improve on this work. So I don't actually have a particular response to all of these comments. Some of these people just take and work on because that's what it needs. I really like this thing that you mentioned about the rural income share, the rural-urban income share dynamics and income growth dynamics. That discussion can be somewhat richer, even with the work that we've already done. With the occupational characteristics that we know, with what we know about how rural incomes compare with urban incomes at each percentile. So using these, there can be a richer discussion on that aspect itself, and perhaps give us somewhat of a deeper sense on why this might be, why we see such a huge discrepancy. Because that discrepancy, it's not just that, the magnitude is high, it's that it's gone negative. So there is a different regime that you've entered. So perhaps, I think that is something that we will also definitely look to do. The one thing that the RGBM was interesting for, and this again, I think the RGBM we will probably discuss in a little bit more detail in this paper. One of the reasons that the RGBM is very interesting, especially for the previous work that we did, that you mentioned, where we looked at data from 1951 to 2014 using the Piketty data set. The reason it was interesting was because one of the challenges that even Piketty and Shankal mentioned in their construction of the Indian income distribution is the fact that they are much more confident about their income data for the top of the distribution because they've used tax data. And, the construction of the bottom is what they are much less confident about. So they have actually constructed about 54 income distributions in that paper. And then they've used one as a base case that they use, right? But actually a lot of this difference comes in the assumptions that they use for creating the bottom half of the distribution, because that is where you're completely in an informal sector. And there is no, so you're completely reliant on NSSO data that you talked about, which is consumption data. So you're trying to estimate income from consumption. And for more recent time periods, you have IHDF data. So they themselves point out to this fact that this is a problem area. What the RGBM in some sense allowed us to do was it allowed us to take the inequality measures from their income distribution and then using that model, create the overall income distribution. Now there, of course, we also model for a range of values of sigma and all that. So you get a sense of, the variation in tau based on how, sigma changes, right? Exactly what you mentioned. And there, the contribution there was to say, this gives us somewhat of a systematic way to explore what might be happening at the bottom of the distribution. Now here, of course, I think in this data, one of the things that where it scores really above, say, Piketty and Shankel's is the fact that it's probably much more reliable at the bottom end, because surveys are what are going to get us that information. I mean, here I think the issue might be at the top end that, this power law kind of distribution you'll never see in survey data. That, it might be, we might be underestimating the share like Nishant mentioned. So there is a distinction in the use of the RGBM there and here. And just as an explanation to you, and I think we should sort of definitely mention this in the paper as well, it was to say that data ended pretty much at the point where this data begins. Now, unfortunately, we cannot use it as a continuous model because the data was created using very different assumptions. So we cannot create just one time series now. So one of the reasons, and this we should definitely mention in the paper, is to say that we have some sense of what might have happened till 2014. And what this is doing is now to helping us reconstruct what might be the continuation of that from 2014 to 2020. And I think Nishant mentioned this, and you're absolutely right that 6 years is too little. And we see that in the distribution. In the overall distribution, the changes are not much at all, right? What we are seeing is that something is though happening in the bottom. And so the interesting sort of outcomes in this are largely empirical. And I think I agree with you that we should sort of strengthen the discussion on what might be causing these discrepancies. So that's sort of my, just a few things that I want to respond to. But thanks so much. I think we will sort of take this into, as we sort of review the paper. And also in a further one last comment. This point that you made about monthly changes, right? And that's sort of one of the big pluses of using this data. That is something that we are definitely doing to look at, and that what that also allows you is, because it's a panel, it allows you to track households over time. Like, where do they fall at different points in time in the distribution, right? So that is definitely something that we are doing. I don't know if it'll be a part of this paper, but definitely as another paper or something, is, something we are also very interested in doing that. So thank you so much.
So sorry, just to keep adding to what Anand was saying, thank you so much again, Dr. Nandwani. So so I have all your comments written down. So if I don't have enough time, I'll definitely reach out to you on email to address them. But kind of just going through some of the things that Anand already discussed, but starting with the monthly income data. So we've created the kind of data panel almost completely using monthly incomes. So we have it's a kind of very nice picture of creating both the income distribution as well as the the CDF of the distribution at every cut that we shoot. So it's just that at some point we believed that maybe at some point to do some robustness checks to compare with other kind of mild estimates coming out, we did the annualized versions, and it also gave us a good way to check growth without having to drop in and deal with the problems of seasonal incomes or missing data points for a particular household over the periods of a year. So kind of helped us kind of cross over some of those by making some assumptions and kind of detailing the data at an annual level. But you're perfectly right. And in fact, it gives us a lot more scope to dive into dynamics within the year, like you said. So that's something we're definitely doing with the occupational aspect. So one of the segues or some side work that we've been doing at Dwara Research as well as with Anand and I have been discussing is just thinking about the whole idea of volatilities of income, especially in the informal sector. And then, in the context of all the employment guarantee programs that we're discussing, kind of the stability of social security and wages that the government's trying to bring in through legislative codes. It's a very, very interesting. There is just that it kind of lays over what we're trying to compress into annual estimates. The expansion of it through monthly estimates is super helpful in kind of just creating something as simple as coefficients of variation of incomes of households within the year, which gives us some massive insight into just into variations, seasonalities, and informality of income, and how difficult it is to quantify it. So that definitely take that point, and would love to we're trying to solve that problem. The other kind of interesting point, yes, we do want to place it in good literature. What we've kind of so this, as you can see, is kind of targeted more at the modeling work so far. This paper is kind of highlighting the novelty of the method itself and trying to kind of understand how but there's also a very large part of literature we would want to contribute to, which is more relating about the public expenditure, like Anand mentioned towards the end. It's just almost all our discourse on public economics and public expenditure comes from the fact of taxes, data from taxes, and data on kind of GDP and public expenditures made towards as a percentage of GDP, etc. So we're nothing that comes back to helping us benchmark to what that is. So we've used NSSO consumption expenditure estimates, we've used poverty estimates before to say what should be a benchmark, but we've never really brought in the idea of inequality or the idea of neutralizing the distributional disparity that exists and has been growing over time. So a lot of the work that we would like to also place it in is in some form. Once we do a more rigorous piece of work, it might be just helpful to place it in the public economic sphere and kind of thinking about it as can it help design better redistribution programs? As again Anand mentioned towards the end, is can we help if UBI were to become a reality? I'm not saying it should, not getting into the debate, but if it were to be, then can these kind of models help you arrive at some portion of what that model should be? Again, really great. And the last point I want to highlight, and I think I tried to do this in the presentation, probably failed to do it pretty well, was the idea of why we use the K index. So we did, so for example, again, along with the panel of income data sets constructed through the CDFs and the distribution curves, we had at every single point and every single month constructed different inequality indices. We constructed the Gini, we constructed the Sen index, constructed the K index. And intuitively, we just believe, and going forward, this is just an assertion, it's just intuitively the K index makes more sense than any other ones that are typically being used. Just typically because of the fact that it's just the generalization of the Pareto. It's just intuitively very, very clear to explain what the K index signifies, as opposed to what Gini does. It only makes sense in a comparative or a relational perspective. It doesn't give you a sense of what does it intuitively tell you about the distribution. So that's the thing. And maybe you're right in the sense that we have to explain this a little bit in the paper. But this was kind of our thinking behind it, is that we arrived at it, and it's a very, very recent piece of work, 2020 published, in fact, but very, very interesting the way they've constructed the index. Intuitively, it just makes so much more sense when we're thinking about distributional disparities. So yeah, so I think on the others, I can kind of get back to you with message with over email on like the volatility parameter explanations on the occupational profile and why we didn't dive into it deeper. But we definitely take most of your points as something to work on constructively. And thanks again for that.
Thank you, Nishant and Anand. We are just slightly over the 7:30 mark, so I'll quickly start wrapping up. I've seen that Anand is already answering questions in the Q&A box. I saw Shubhratoda had a question. I think Anand's already answered that. And Anand is, I think, also in the process of answering some questions from Swati and Amrita. Anand and Nishant, I think this is really interesting. This work on income inequality is so necessary in India, and I think yours is one of the first papers that does this using the CPHS data. And like both of you said, as well as like Bharti said, there are many advantages in the data set and in the way in which we collect our data. And it's really fascinating to see the work that you did, and we're really excited for the extensions that you have in mind. Some of the points that Bharti raised about the availability of monthly data, etc., digging in more into those heterogeneous trends at the state level, potentially relying on much more of the consumption data that's available on top of the methodological improvements like the RGBM model, the use of the K-index. I think will really, really be very, very interesting to see. Bharti, the comments that you made, absolutely outstanding. It's not for me to say, it's for the authors to say, but since they've already said it, I'm happy to repeat it. Really great, I think, in terms of framing the work and contextualizing it for an audience that, may not be so familiar with the new measures of inequality like the K-index. Also framing it from the point of view of other research that exists, what this is doing that's novel, that's different, how it's utilizing not just methodological changes, but also new data sets that are available to try and say something that's more recent, more topical, breaking down these trends that you're finding, very interesting trends among rural and urban. I think really exciting. So thank you. The comments were absolutely great. And I think it will really help the authors also in working on this paper as well as extensions. Nishant and Anand, again, a big thank you to the both of you. If you don't mind, I'm going to close the session since we're past the 7:30 mark. There are just a couple of questions remaining in the Q&A. What we usually do when we run over time is audience members will make sure to put all the question askers in touch with the question answerers so that you can have a longer conversation over email over some of these points. And that still gives you a way to make sure that you're addressing all the questions that have come up in the Q&A. So thank you again, Nishant, Anand, Bharti, for participating in the 6th Consumer Pyramids Household Survey Research Seminar. Thanks to the audience for coming. Great questions. I think this really excites a lot of people in terms of additional work that can be done in income inequality in India. And we really look forward to seeing more work from both of you and hopefully at another seminar in the near future.
We'd have to book before it books out.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Coach. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishant. Thanks, Anand. Thanks, Bharti. Bye.